What I'm struggling with is that I feel like I'm giving into my privilege when I try to feel better. Other people don't get to look away. This is the conversation we need to be having. Thank you for this comment. I know it's deeply felt by a lot of folks. You are definitely not alone in this thought process, and I'm determined to break the myth that sitting with your privilege means not allowing yourself to heal or feel joy. So instead of giving you a quick take, I want to walk through some research, define a few terms, and offer some food for thought. As always, take what works and leave what doesn't. My take is just one take, and I'm sure there are folks who would disagree with my framing or have their own to add, and it's all welcome here. Realistically, this is a fluid conversation. So let's get into it. First and foremost, let's define privilege. One paper describes privilege as something granted, not earned, and often outside of the awareness of the person possessing it. That's Black and Stone in 2005. There are many ways to talk about privilege, but I personally find it helpful to distinguish between what I'll call fixed and fluid forms of privilege. So these aren't formal academic categories, they're just a framework. Fixed privilege would include race, ethnicity, birthplace, certain physical abilities, and these are not chosen and cannot be returned or removed just by feeling bad about them. Then we have fluid privilege, which would be socioeconomic status, education, relationship status, and some aspects of health, and these can shift across a lifetime. So when you say you're giving in to privilege by trying to feel better, I hear you touching two things at once. One, which would be the distress that comes with recognizing privilege you cannot shed, that cognitive and emotional dissonance that often collapses into shame instead of the action that many of us want to take. And two, a sense of disentitlement to life and aliveness, which is very similar to what we see in survivor guilt. And as much as we hope it will, the guilt doesn't actually produce repair. What it does instead is it produces rumination. That looping thought of, I shouldn't feel better because I don't deserve to have this, doesn't actually help anyone on either side of the equity gap. Now I want to talk about the difference between shame and guilt in the context of privilege. So privilege guilt says, I have something others don't and I care about that. And privilege shame says, I am bad for having it. Shame about fixed privilege is basically shame about existence itself. It's the least actionable and one of the most depleting forms of suffering available to us as humans because it changes nothing in anyone else's circumstances. What it does instead is just redistributes pain inward and keeps us stuck in that loop. I have something others don't and I shouldn't. I don't deserve to feel well when others are suffering, and it just loops back and forth, kind of like a figure eight. And instead of the repair that we're hoping for, we're in rumination, which is a nervous system state and not a moral achievement. And even though these loops can sound like solidarity and accountability, they often function more like self-punishment and that constriction of shame. And when we have the space to, we also have to be very honest about who benefits when we stay trapped in that shame loop. When we are so consumed with punishing ourselves for what we have less energy, less clarity, and less capacity to challenge the systems that created those inequalities in the first place. In that way, staying stuck in self-directed shame can unintentionally serve the very structures we're grieving and trying to rail against. Audre Lorde wrote that in order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. Joy, aliveness, and pleasure are some of those sources of power. This is where gratitude comes in as a different kind of response to privilege. So a gratitude practice acknowledges the reality of unearned advantage without collapsing into shame. It helps keep the nervous system regulated enough to stay in relationship with injustice. And it helps orient our attention toward what is available and what is possible, and not just what is wrong and immovable. Gratitude essentially says, I am aware of what I have, I don't take it for granted, and I choose to use it. And this framing supports the kind of regulation we need to have to do something, to stay engaged, set boundaries, take action, and remain connected. The beautiful thing about this is that gratitude and joy tend to expand our window of tolerance, which is what makes sustained engagement with hard things possible in the first place. So now we have to talk about emotional contagion. Christakis and Fowler, using data from the Framingham Heart Study, tracked nearly 5,000 people over 20 years and found that happiness spreads up to 3 degrees through a social network, so to friends, friends of friends, and friends of friends of friends. And the effect can last up to 1 year. And interestingly, they also found that sadness does not spread through networks as robustly as happiness does. So this gives us an empirical counter-argument to the idea that your joy doesn't help anyone. It actually does in measurable ways. Neurobiologically, your nervous system is a transmitter. It's not just a container. Joy doesn't stay inside you. Through emotional contagion and mirror system activation, the people around you receive a signal from your regulated, alive state. When we observe someone else's positive emotional expression, mirror systems in the brain light up in ways that resemble having the experience ourselves. And this is the basis of co-regulation. Your nervous system already knows how to receive and transmit joy, but are you giving it permission to do so? And when I talk about leaning into joy, I'm not talking about overconsumption or ignoring harm. I'm talking about sustainable enjoyment that renews you and your community. My joy, specifically as a Black woman and as a therapist, is not a neutral act. It is very much a political one. So here's what I want to leave you with. My goal here is not to minimize the complex impact of survivor guilt. We're not erasing feelings. That's not how this works, and that's not what I'm in the business of. My goal is to help disrupt the repetitive cycle of rumination by encouraging an active acceptance of your privilege and your survival with all of their multi-layered emotional experiences. You can hold both grief and joy without having to resolve the tension first. In fact, that's one of the goals of expanding the window of tolerance. It's being able to sit with multiple, even conflicting emotions at the same time without collapsing into them. Denying yourself the ability to live a full, joyful life does not honor people who are less privileged and suffering. It actually ends up adding more suffering to a world that has more than enough of it. Allowing yourself more grounded joy decreases suffering, and it actively adds more joy into the collective system. And that has a ripple effect through communities, and that is not to be minimized. That's deeply important. So your joy is a right and an act of defiance against all the systems at play that are hoping that we keep lashing ourselves. I'm not going to give them that. That's what I'll leave you with. I hope that this was helpful. I'm so curious your thoughts.